to unmute. Right. Okay. Thanks everyone for joining today. I'm Jim Sutherland. I'm the Director for SPT2 for RIIO T2 for SP Energy Networks. The purpose of the call is to provide an update and get views on the work we've done to date on the future energy scenarios to inform our next transmission price review. We published a document recently which set out our thinking so far, and we sought views on the approach and the findings. For those of you who haven't seen this document, we can provide a link later. I'm joined here by colleagues from SP Energy Networks and also Baringa and Element Energy, who have been helping us with this work. And the outline agenda for the call is as follows. First, I'll give a short overview for the context for the price reviews and the future role of transmission. Then Luke Humphrey from Baringa will describe the approach to the scenarios work and some of the findings. Next up, Kirsten McIver from the SP team will discuss the alignment of the scenarios with government targets and how they're reflected in our plans. Finally, we'll move to a Q&A session. Now, there is an option to do Q&A via the audio in the webinar, but our experience is it's best if people can submit them via the chat facility to the Energy Networks hosts as we go along. Can I also ask that everyone remains on mute during the presentation to ensure that we avoid any unintentional background noise. And the other thing I would say is that for those who have joined via the dial-in facility, that will be listen only, so you won't be able to ask questions via that. So if we move on then, before going into the detail of scenarios, I'd like to spend a few minutes just talking about the context for this work. I'll cover the evolving regulatory framework and a bit about how we're approaching the creation of our transmission business plan for the next regulatory period. As a natural monopoly organisation, we are regulated and subject to price controls. Every few years, these price controls are reset via a process known as a price review, and the latest of these price reviews is known as RIIO T2. The set of principles for determining price controls has evolved over many years. Collectively, these are referred to as RIIO, which is short for Revenues equals Incentives plus Innovation plus Outputs. It sounds very simple, and of course it's very much a simplification of a complex set of rules. Nevertheless, it does highlight the priorities of the regulatory regime, that is, the essential roles of incentives in driving change, the ongoing need to encourage innovation across the sector, and the importance of ensuring that outputs are delivered in line with what was agreed. At the moment, Ofgem is reviewing the framework, and in July this year proposed a number of changes in the new version known as RIIO 2. At this stage, I think it's fair to describe this as an evolution of the framework rather than revolution, as many of the core principles are still retained. However, further updates are expected later this year when we will see some more specific detail for the transmission sector. In this slide, the RIIO T2 programme, we have a very high-level timetable for the transmission price review. You can see that from our perspective, the next year is focused on the preparation of a business plan, which we will publish along with a detailed set of tables and narrative. These will form the basis for the assessment phase, during which Ofgem will analyse and compare plans before making proposals to the companies around the end of 2020. If companies agree at that stage, then the new price controls will take effect from April 2021. Although if there is, for some reason, an appeal to the Competition and Markets Authority, this could see the process run slightly beyond that date. The next slide is about stakeholder engagement and for transmission. A key part of the new RIIO 2 framework is stakeholder engagement, and this slide shows how things are evolving for the transmission sector, and these arrangements will be mirrored elsewhere too in the gas and electricity distribution sectors. On the left, we have our existing stakeholder engagement arrangements, which are a feature of our business as usual activities. These will continue, but will be supplemented by a new transmission owner user group, an independent panel with a remit to help challenge and shape our business plan on behalf of those who use and pay for the transmission system. For our part, we have appointed Charles Henry, the former Energy Minister, to chair our user group, and he will be supported by 12 members who bring expertise from a variety of backgrounds. In addition to the groups formed by each company, an Ofgem challenge group is also being created, and this group will look across all sectors and all company plans, challenging where appropriate and providing Ofgem with a report on its findings. However, it's important to re-emphasise that these groups do not replace the wider stakeholder engagement process. We will continue to engage more broadly with stakeholders on key issues within our plan. So this webinar today is one of a series we will be holding in the months to come to allow a range of people to have their say on the creation of our plan. As far as our plan itself is concerned, as in the past, it will cover a range of topics, both financial and non-financial. These will include future operations and maintenance, innovation, replacement and refurbishment expenditure, and of course, investment required to cater for new and changing usage of the transmission network, which is where the future energy scenarios that we're about to discuss will play an important role. We also have to recognise the importance of deliverability when preparing these plans. And by that I mean, do we have the resources and the access to the system to be able to carry out the work? The transmission system is a critically important piece of national infrastructure. It's operated to a very strict, stringent security of supply standard, which sometimes means there are limited windows of opportunity to take assets out of service to carry out investment work. So from a volume point of view, if we were to propose too much investment in the next period, we'd struggle to get the necessary outages to carry out the work. On the other hand, if we were to defer too much investment, it could create a bottleneck in a future period. The trick is to strike the right balance, taking a long-term view over multiple price control periods. So against that background, we want to talk about the scenarios that will drive our demand and generation-related investment plans. I mentioned that the transmission system is a critical piece of national infrastructure, but what role will it play in the future energy system? The transmission network's primary role is bulk transfer of energy. As such, it is a vital means to transport very large amounts of electrical energy cost effectively, efficiently and reliably. For example, on a windy day, Scotland already produces far more renewable energy than it consumes, and the SPT network provides the means to transfer thousands of megawatts to other parts of the UK. At times when the wind is not blowing, Scotland relies on the transmission network to import the power that's needed to keep the lights on. At a national level, the economic benefit from being able to flexibly deploy different forms of generation in this way is huge, and the transmission network is key to our ability to harness this resource in the most economic way. The future electricity system will be more decentralised and have more dynamic, varying power flows. The degree to which this happens will depend partly on technology and also on the behaviours and preferences of future energy producers and consumers, hence the need to look at scenarios. However, the transmission network will continue to connect areas with an excess of output from large and small generators to other parts of the country where that excess energy can be utilised. Transmission capacity will continue to be required to link supply to demand, for instance, to connect large offshore wind installations or interconnectors to other parts of Europe. For such large-scale plant, a connection at a transmission voltage is the only viable and cost-effective option for the high power transfers required. Another key role for transmission is its role in black start. A complete blackout of the electricity network is very unlikely, and we hope it never happens, but there is a remote chance that it could. In such an event, it's essential to have a fit-for-purpose transmission system that's capable of facilitating the complex task of re-establishing supplies. It's not just a simple matter of switching everything back on. Not all generators are capable of starting themselves and energising a dead network. Those that can are larger transmission-connected plant. They would be used to progressively re-establish a stable system, carefully controlling the frequency and network voltages as more load and generation is added. Finally, the transmission network is not static and constantly has to respond to changes in demand and generation. Older power stations close and some demand disappears, while new generation and new demand connect. Our challenge is to provide the right amount of transmission network capacity at the right time. If enough capacity is not available on time, this will restrict generators' access to the electricity market, leading to higher prices for consumers. To help us understand the changes and new technologies that could affect our transmission network, SP Energy Networks teamed up with Baringa and Element Energy, who have taken a closer look at how the network might evolve in future. So at this stage, I'll hand over to Luke Humphrey, who will take you through the methodology and some of the results so far.
Thank you, Jim. So as has been said, Baringa and Element Energy have been working with Hello, we're just having a few IT issues at this end. Wait one sec. Well, hopefully everybody can hear me now. So thank you, Jim, for that introduction. As has been said, Baringa and Element Energy have been working with SP Energy Networks in developing a range of load planning scenarios. And we use these to test the credible range of how power flows could evolve over the SPT network. Over the next few slides, I'm going to provide just an overview of the approach to creating these planning scenarios, and then we'll look through some of the key results. So the scenarios are intended to provide a holistic view of supply and demand in the SPT area from now out until 2040. And that's going to be used to inform SPT's wider price control analysis. The horizon of study that's been chosen, so that's from now to 2040, that covers the RIIO T2 period and also the decade beyond. And that allows SP Energy Networks to plan with a view both to the medium term, but also with a view to the longer term. And as we'll see, some of those longer term decisions could be important. The four scenarios that we've used, they're aligned at a high level with the National Grid future energy scenarios, and we've taken the 2018 version of those, the most recent update of those scenarios. We use the same scenario names and we use the same dimensions to split these scenarios. So those dimensions are the rate of decarbonisation, slow and faster, and the rate of decentralisation. However, although we've taken these scenarios at the high level, we've then put in significant work to tailor these scenarios so that they reflect the specific conditions for the SPT network rather than the kind of aggregate position that's in the Great Britain focused National Grid numbers. And we've done that through use of Scottish Power specific data, a number of other sources. These are generally public and referenceable, and also extensive stakeholder engagement throughout the process. And I think many of you on the call will have been at some of these events and within some of those discussions. So the stakeholder engagement, it's covered members from government, industry, academia, and we've done that through a series of bilateral discussions and also a number of workshops. The scenarios themselves, they consider all electricity demand and supply and storage within the SPT area. And this is at all network levels. So although we're considering the SPT, the transmission network, we're looking at supply and demand on the transmission network directly, but then also at the distribution level and down to behind the meter supply. So for example, behind the meter could be building level solar. And it's very important to note that the scenario results that we have provided Scottish Power with, they're disaggregated down to the individual grid supply points within the SPT area. What do we mean by grid supply points? So these are the physical points where the SPT network connects to the distribution network below. And it's key, very important to understand how these power flows over these points may change, because that allows SPT to understand planning investment right down at the local level on their network. This slide and the next few, they're going to provide a snapshot of some key results, starting with electricity demand, then we'll look at supply, and then finally we'll look at the integration of the two. One thing to note is that the results that we're showing today, it's a highly condensed version of what's in the public consultation document. So if you do want more detail, I definitely recommend you download that and take a look. For the scenario analysis here, we've focused on conditions at the winter peak period and the summer minimum load period, as these are the key potential drivers for reinforcement. At both time periods, the level of change through the RIIO T2 period and out to 2030 is expected to be actually fairly modest in all scenarios. And we can see that in the chart on the right. However, if we're looking, that chart on the right is looking at the winter peak demand. While there is a modest change in demand, that's due to two things offsetting each other. So we've got significant reductions in domestic demand, but that's being offset by new sources of demand, particularly from electric vehicles and heat pumps. And much of that new demand is expected to be flexible. What do we mean by flexible? So we're talking about any load that can be shifted or reduced, particularly at times of stress on the system. So for example, a smartly managed electric vehicle may be managed in such a way that it avoids any charging during the system peak period, potentially shifting that charging to an overnight period where demand from other sources is low. However, if these new sources of load don't turn out to be as flexible as expected, then we can see actually there could be some material increases in the winter peak demand. And a final point to note is that when we look at these results in the chart, these are for the aggregate demand for the SPT area as a whole. And this is masking some significant variations that we see at individual grid supply points. So if we look at the results here where we see fairly modest changes for the SPT area as a whole with these flexibility assumptions, if we look at individual supply points within that, we see some are having swings of upwards of 10% demand and some downwards by 15% between now and 2030. So the aggregate results are just one way of viewing what's going on, and actually looking down at GSP level is very important. So if we now dig a little deeper into these new sources of demand, we're looking at electric vehicles and heat pumps in particular. There's an expectation that the deployment of electric vehicles could grow rapidly by 2030, but the deployment of heat pumps is slightly lagging behind this. So the scenarios indicate a range of uptake of between 4 and 20% for electric vehicles. So that's 4 and 20% of the fleet being electrified by 2030. And actually, it seems high numbers, but the upper end of this range was closely aligned with what we got from external stakeholder feedback, and also quite closely aligned with Scottish Government targets. It's expected that there'll be a degree of clustering of this new EV load. Particularly, there's going to be more in urban areas we expect, and that's shown in the heat map, the GSP heat map in the top right figure. So that's showing the number of EVs per GSP in 2030. So there's some areas there which are showing very high numbers of EVs, starting from virtually none today. However, if flexible charging is available, then that's going to mitigate a significant proportion of the potential increase in peak demand. Now, if we turn to heat pumps, in contrast with EVs, heat pumps are projected to have a lower uptake, and we might reach penetration of, say, between 2% and 12% of buildings by 2030. That's what the scenarios are showing. And then the middle of this range was viewed as being the most realistic by our stakeholders. Even if we look at the upper end of this range, then it is still below what is implied by the Scottish Government target. So the Scottish Government target is for a 35% of heat production to be low carbon by around 2030. I mean, we have to be a bit careful there. We're not quite comparing like with like. The Scottish Government target is technology agnostic. So it would, if we're comparing like with like, we'd be saying that all low carbon heat is coming from heat pumps, which is not necessarily the case. However, the difference between this 35% target and the 12 at our upper end it does seem like there's a difference there in total low carbon heat production. Switching now to the supply side, one of the key features that we see across the scenarios is a large expansion of renewables and in particular wind. So at the transmission level, and that's shown in the bottom left chart, the wind capacity could more than double by 2030, but there is quite a range in the capacity that we see across the different scenarios. And that difference is particularly driven by assumptions on offshore wind capacity. And that matches what we saw from stakeholders, that there was uncertainty as to what that capacity might be. When we combine this increase in capacity for renewables with known retirements for thermal and nuclear plants, it's expected that there's be much greater flows across the SPT network at times of high renewable output. Turning now to distribution generation, so this is the bottom right chart. The growth in supply capacities in the next couple of years from known projects that are going to connect to the distribution network is expected to be fairly modest compared with what's been seen in the last few years. But if we look out to 2030, then things pick up again, and there could potentially be significant expansion in supply at the distribution level in the worlds where we assume a high decentralization. So in these high decentralization scenarios, the distribution level supply could more than double, and there's significant expansions in wind, but also solar, biomass, and storage capacity. On the other dimension, in the two high decarbonization scenarios, so that's the 2 degrees in community renewables, the level of renewable power generation, it meets the UK and Scottish government targets, while in the lower decarbonisation scenarios, these targets are missed. Okay, so now we've looked at the evolution of supply, and we've looked at the evolution of demand, but that's in isolation. Now we're going to look at how they interact. And it's important to understand the net supply demand position across the network at the times of system stress, so particularly the winter peak, because that is a key driver of the need for future reinforcement. So for the SPT area as a whole, we expect the net supply or the net demand, to drop by between 3% and 35% by 2030, and that's due to a significant expansion of decentralized generation and also new sources of load being connected, but those being flexible and not seen in the peak period. But as noted before, these trends are looking at the whole SPT level, and they can mask more significant variation when we look down to the grid supply points. So the figure on the right shows the relative change, so the absolute change in peak load across the time period. So we've got 2025 and then out to 2030, and across the 90 grid supply points individually. In the community renewables scenario, where we have the highest increase in decentralized generation, over half of the GSPs exhibit a net decline in peak load of between 5 and 20 megawatts. But then there's an additional third of GSPs which show a drop of over 20 megawatts. Now, we're talking about that as a drop in demand. It could be an increase in supply. And these GSPs, many of them may well become net supply GSPs to the SPT network. So these kind of changes have the potential that they have significant implications for GSP capacity and its ability to accommodate new generation. It's important to reiterate that the decline in net demand assumes significant flexibility from new load from sources such as electric vehicles. And if this load proves harder to manage and is less flexible than we've assumed, and then the clustering effects mean that there's a number of GSPs that could rapidly become demand constrained, even while others are and exhibiting a decline in net demand, or maybe the network as a whole is experiencing a decline in net demand. So in summary, there are a number of key takeaways from the scenario analysis. Firstly, there is significant uncertainty around the scale of distributed wind generation and electric vehicle demand across the period. But the most rapid changes happen just outside of the RIIO T2 period, just into 2030. But the scale of these potential changes from these two technologies in particular is significant enough that it's important that these changes, while outside of the RIIO T2 period, are included in the planning process to ensure that the SPT network does not act as a barrier to the more widespread deployment of these low carbon sources of supply and demand in the future. Secondly, even with the uncertainty over the level of growth, the absolute volumes of wind on the system is expected to increase significantly compared with today, and that's going to lead to much greater variation in the power flows across the SPT network. Thirdly, there's a clear distinction in the expected growth of new sources of demand, with a much more rapid expansion of electric vehicles expected compared with heat pumps. And then finally, as we've noted several times, the aggregate trends, they mask a much more significant variation at individual GSP. And in many cases, there's a significant expansion of the decentralized generation, which is going to lead to network constraints that need to be managed. And then there's going to be other GSPs where the concentration of new load, if it's less flexible than expected, it's going to drive a need for reinforcement. So I hope that's been clear and has given you an idea of the key results of our work. There's more detail in the public consultation document. I'm now going to hand over to Kirsten McIver, who's going to talk more about how the outcomes of the load planning scenarios are going to be used as part of Scottish Power's RIIO T2 plan.
Thanks very much, Luke. I will now talk through how we intend to use these scenarios as part of our planning. In previous price reviews, any scenarios that have been used have been given macro views of the SPT area with a general network demand pattern, but not broken down into specific network areas. Our newly developed scenarios are able to give us a much more granular view of the network to allow us to have a view of the future of each grid supply point and make a much more informed decision on investments. As previously discussed, our scenarios have been based upon the future energy scenarios developed and published by National Grid, but with a much more spatial view and an additional local knowledge. From the outset of this work, it was important for us to stay consistent with the National Grid's phase, as these are industry-wide recognised scenarios and give us an independent starting point. The overall results remain generally in line with National Grid phase, and therefore we're remaining consistent with industry processes, the network options assessment. Using our scenarios to provide an envelope of upper and lower limits for changes that could occur in our system, we're going to do some detailed system analysis across the network to individual GSP levels to indicate any changes that may lead to the need for investment. This envelope of uncertainty will provide us with a means to have a flexible business plan that will be ready to accommodate any foreseeable situation that may require investment. Please note that network investment doesn't always mean large asset investment. In some cases, generation can be accommodated through the use of network management schemes, and in many cases, other innovative solutions will be considered in line with traditional build schemes. Throughout our scenario development, a key stakeholder was SP distribution. By including the DNO in the development of these scenarios, we are taking a whole system approach to our planning. Where there are options to span the T and the transmission and distribution boundary, both T and D solutions will be considered within the cost-benefit analysis to ensure that the most economic and efficient solution is found to give the best value to the consumer. So, ahead of our detailed network study using the scenarios, the following conclusions can already be drawn from this piece of work. In any scenario, the transmission network plays an essential role in ensuring that generation can continue to meet demand where it is required. In most cases, we see the different scenarios often do not change the need for reinforcement projects, instead it just affects the timing of such projects. There is a wide range of uncertainty in the expected levels of demand and supply in the long-term scenarios, but the most rapid change happens from late 2020 onwards, i.e. shortly after the RIIO T2 period. A sensitivity is that if the uptake of any of these scenarios is more rapid, this will have an impact on T2. We're also anticipating that some investment may be required towards the end of T2 in anticipation for the rapid uptake in early years of T3. Aggregate SPT level changes can mask more sizable changes at small number of GSPs over the RIIO T2 period, which could drive the need for reinforcement. But the majority of them, there is a shift towards decentralised supply in the period to up to 2030, and therefore reductions in demand. Although we see a rapid uptake of EVs across the network, with over 500,000 expected EVs on the road by 2030, in 2 our scenarios, EV growth does not drive significant transmission investment, assuming the rollout of EVs is carried out in a coordinated manner by the distribution network. If this is not the case, EVs could make transmission load profile more difficult to manage, potentially leading to the need for network investment. We do not expect electrification of heat to have a significant impact on our network during T2. The level of flexibility associated with demand, for example from electric vehicles and heat pumps, is highly uncertain. By 2030, the band of domestic demand flexibility assumed in these scenarios is from about 1.8% to 8.6%. Without this flexibility being realised, peak demand will grow more rapidly, potentially requiring more than 3 gigawatts of additional capacity. Network planning through the RIIO T2 period also needs to ensure that it can accommodate the more rapid changes that are seen thereafter, for example in the early part of RIIO T3 through to 2030. Growth of decentralised generation can be hampered by a range of issues on interfaces between networks, for example fault level constraints. Careful consideration is required to address these in a coordinated approach. Finally, we don't expect storage volumes to grow in capacity to the point where they would avoid network reinforcement within the RIIO T2 period, even with the highest scenario only getting to around 500 megawatts of storage across the network by 2030. Currently, storage schemes under development aim mostly at the frequency response market, and it's anticipated that this may remain the case for some time. At this point, we'd now like to invite your questions on the material we've just presented and published within the document itself. If you could your questions via the chat function in SP Energy Networks, or alternatively you can raise your virtual hand and we can invite you to ask. While we're waiting on the questions coming in, it's probably a good point to remind you that currently this document is out for consultation on our website. There's a few questions in that consultation document that we're looking to have your feedback on. So we've got a question here in asking, did you have any findings where FES and your scenarios were different? I think that's probably a good question for Luke from Baringa.
Thanks, Kirsten. So I think in terms of the total capacities that we were seeing, these were generally fairly well aligned with the FES results, the National Grid Future Energy Scenario results, and that was quite deliberate in that we were trying to keep the holistic nature and the whole system nature of the National Grid scenarios that look at Great Britain as a whole. So we're trying to keep the supply-demand balance broadly aligned, so that our piece of that puzzle, the Scottish Power Network piece of that puzzle, fits in with the other transmission networks. Where we differed significantly is in where that capacity was sited down at the GSP level. So in the national grid work, they do some of that in terms of siting capacity by GSP, but some of the assumptions there that they haven't got the visibility of the local data that Scottish Power have of their network, and also some of the assumptions that they're kind of for Great Britain as a whole, which is often dominated by large demand centres down in England. So it was that siting of capacity that was significantly different. Now, I think I'm not going to go through technology by technology how we did that siting. I think the main thing to know is that we've tried to take a more detailed approach and a more bespoke approach that matches all the data that we have available for the Scottish Power Network.
That's great. Thank you very much, Luke. We've got another question in here. It says, you seem to have aligned/compared your scenarios to Scottish Government plans. Did you also consider base strategies? I think we'll switch to Martin Hill to answer this question.
Thanks, Kirsten. Yeah, the FES scenarios are actually built up using the BEIS policies as the overall background. So we've almost implicitly included all of the national policies and targets as part of the analysis. Where we're referring to the Scottish Government targets are almost in addition to that, because recognising that the customers that we serve are all within the Scottish area, we were trying to add that extra dimension so that we do have the comparison to the Scottish Government targets. So almost by default, we're also considering what we're achieving the national targets as well. As Luke mentioned, within the FES, it's only 2 of the 4 scenarios which actually achieve all of those government targets. Hopefully that answers the question that was raised. Sorry, I see there was also a question. The presentation, I can confirm the presentation will be available afterwards, and we'll also have a recording of the full webinar, so anybody who is unable to join will be able to kind of listen back to the whole thing as well then.
Okay, I've just spotted another question there. The question was the scope for large-scale solar PV considered? I think that's another one to hand over to Luke, so I'll just hand over to him.
Thanks, Kirsten. So we did consider large-scale PV. The majority there was considered at the distribution level. There's some limited sites at the transmission level, but it's mainly at the distribution level. The capacities assumed are fairly modest compared with what is expected in FES for the rest of GB. And it's also modest, I think, compared with the home level or rooftop level PV. The level of PV is not a key driver of changes at peak, because the peak occurs in the winter when the solar output is low. So we've got these 2 factors of the capacities assumed for the SPT network being a bit lower than you see in the rest of GB because of the solar supply here, and it not being a key driver of the change in supply and demand at the peak period.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that, Luke. I think we're going to hand on to Martin now, because we've had a question in asking, have you had any general feedback on your work to date which would lead you to modify your approach? Martin, would you be able to give us an answer to that?
So far, we've not had any particular feedback. Really, that was kind of part of this exercise, was to kind of get some other views. As we'd mentioned, we have engaged with a number of different stakeholders bilaterally and through different forums to inform this. I think we've had a really good constructive relationship with the FES team as well, in the way that we've built this information up to ensure that we are consistent. And certainly any feedback that we get from this in terms of any areas that we've maybe not considered, or we've got strongly different views, we'll be looking to share that more generally as well, to ensure that, particularly as we look forward to next year's phase, we can build upon that approach.
Okay, thanks for that, Martin. I think we're now going to switch remotely to London to answer the next question that's come in. The question is flexibility switching off EV charging during peak times realistic? Seem, if we hand over to...
Okay, thank you, Kirsten. It's of course always a question if it's realistic. There is definitely a lot more uptake expected of smart charging, which will enable that switching off during peak charging. And I think one important thing to note is that we stuck to the national grid scenarios, which have vastly increased their assumptions on flexible charging in the 2018 version. And this is based on stakeholder engagement. So it's not certain, but there's definitely high expectations of this smart charging. And I think it's also important to note, as Luke mentioned before, is that we have provided the numbers to SP Energy Networks as well, which tell what the peak demand would be if the smart charging was not as if there would not be as much smart charging as predicted by the national grid scenarios, which can be used as a sensitivity study by SP Energy Networks in their load planning.
Okay, thank you very much for that input, Seem. I think at this stage we are going to wrap up the questions there. We've taken note of anything that came in from that we didn't get round to answering. We had quite an inrush of questions, so thank you very much for that input. So I'm just going to move on to wrap this up. So following the conclusion of our scenarios development, as discussed, we will study the network in detail using each of the scenarios to determine where the issues that may arise in the T2 period and beyond. The range of possibilities that the scenarios give us will allow us to have the best picture of where the network might go in the future and to build enough flex in our business plan to do so. In addition to our scenario work, we're also currently working on our non-load investment plan and building in both innovation and sustainability in all aspects of our work. We have already undertaken a number of stakeholder engagement sessions and will seek further ideas and feedback throughout this planning stage. As always, we will keep you, our stakeholders, updated along the way. At this stage, I'd like to remind you that the consultation period for these scenarios comes to a close on the 28th of September, so please remember to send in your responses as we are keen to gather as much of a wide response range as we can. With that, thank you very much for taking part in this webinar today. If you wish any further information on the work we are undertaking or any further questions come into your mind beyond this webinar, please send queries to RIIO_T2 at spenergynetworks.co.uk and we will circulate this slide to everyone after the session. Thank you very much for taking part today.